Plank pose is without question one of the most efficient strengtheners in yoga. It strengthens the shoulders, the arms, the anterior core, and even the legs. The only problem with plank, arguably, is that we don't do it enough for long enough. Oftentimes, plank pose is just a transition. We do it between down dog and chaturanga. So what I want to do today is I want to break down my 5 favorite versions of the pose, show you some of the variations that I incorporate into all of my sequences, give you the breakdowns, the verbal cues that I like to share with my students, and tell you a little bit about why each one of these different variations deserves a spot in your practice or in your sequences. My name is Jason Crandall. I've been a highly respected yoga teacher for nearly 30 years. I've traveled the world many times over teaching, and now I've settled in and created the best online courses for people that want to become yoga teachers and for yoga teachers that want to continue their depth and their study. For those of you that want to learn more about my online offerings, check all the information below. The first variation of plank to incorporate into your practice or your sequences is what I call longer plank. In longer plank, we just take our hands a big step forward. This requires your anterior abdominals to work much more intensely. So your rectus abdominis, your transversus abdominis, and your obliques are working in a good, strong isometric way. I tend to incorporate this pose when I'm doing practices that are more focused on overt core strengthening. And the nice thing about this pose, you can use it at pretty much any level. A beginner can do it for a couple of breaths, and a more seasoned student might be able to do it for 30 seconds or a minute. So instead of just dropping it quickly into a flow where we're transitioning, I will tend to incorporate it into a flow and actually hold the pose for several deep breaths. To practice or teach the pose skillfully, we just transition into plank, then we look down and we take our hands about a hand's length forward. And mind you, the further you take the hands forward, the more challenging it is. But you want to cue your students to look down and see that the hands are in front of the shoulders, not underneath the shoulders. Once we have this initial setup, we want our students to press the floor away and broaden our shoulder blades. So our students are protracting their shoulder blades. And in addition to strengthening other parts of the front of the shoulders, this protraction is going to help strengthen the serratus anterior, an integral scapular muscle that's really valuable to bring greater strength and tone to. As our students push the floor away and broaden their shoulder blades, I prefer a very slight external rotation of the arms. So I like to gently rotate the biceps forward. I ask my students to draw the front ribs in away from the front of their shirts. What this is going to do is help reduce lumbar curvature. I don't mind if the lower back maintains a little bit of natural curve or if the lower back is completely flat, but I don't want the lower back to hammock. So as we lift those front ribs, we get more engagement to our anterior abdominals. Building on this, I like to tell my students to lengthen the sacrum and the tailbone towards the back of their thighs. This induces just a tiny bit of posterior tilt, which can further help those anterior abdominals work. Then I ask my students to engage the glutes, the quads, and create the action as if they're hugging the inner thighs in. After this pose, we can segue back into downward facing dog, or we can shift forward, come to the floor, or go through chaturanga, up dog. We can come to the floor for locust or cobra. Our second variation of plank builds strength, stamina, and balance. I like to incorporate this in pretty much any one of my flow classes. It's a way to break up what can be the monotony of just regular plank. It also flows really nice and seamlessly in and out of standing poses. If it feels a little bit too challenging for some of your students, you can always bring the opposite knee down. So the leg that is staying in contact with the ground, the foot that is staying in contact with the ground, you can bring that knee to the floor to give the whole pose more steadiness and ease. I like to enter one arm, one leg plank from one-legged downward facing dog. And what I typically do and what I typically teach is to actually raise the opposite arm, the arm that we're gonna lift, before we get all the way to plank. I like to actually raise that arm in transition. So to do this, we're gonna go into downward facing dog. We're gonna raise the right leg. So we're in one-legged downward facing dog. Now, as we start to transition forward to plank, we get about 2/3 or 3/4 to plank. We press the floor away, we broaden the scapula. So once again, the scapula are protracting. We raise and we reach the left arm forward. So left arm and right leg are elevated. The first thing that I like to have students do is focus on their base. The right hand and the left foot are forming a diagonal of stability. And you really want to encourage your students to root down, ground down, trench down into that base. I almost like to have the feeling that the right hand and the left foot are almost stretching the mat, right? That pressing down and kind of pulling away from each other creates a good tone. Now, when we're working with the lifted part of the body, I want them to stay level. So the left arm, the torso, and the right leg, I want those to be level with the floor. If a student raises the leg too much, almost invariably that's gonna anteriorly tilt the pelvis, disconnect the work of the abdominals, and take the lower back into much more curve than we want for this pose. After 2 or 3 breaths, we bring our left hand back to the floor. Then typically I would go back into a one-legged downward facing dog, add a twist. And then you can just go to the second side, or like I said earlier, this is a really nice segue between standing poses. It kind of enlivens the whole sequence. So from here, you could step that right foot forward into a crescent lunge, a low lunge, or any standing pose flow. The third variation of plank is what I call marching arms plank. And it's a really, really effective strengthener. This is a hard pose. This is incredibly effective at strengthening the arms, the shoulders, and the anterior core. And it really combines some of the demands of the first version, longer plank, with the second version, one arm, one leg plank. I typically incorporate this variation of plank in one of 3 conditions. Number 1, I'm doing a sequence where I want to focus a little bit more on shoulder strength and shoulder demand, because you'll see when we reach one arm forward, the whole shoulder girdle has to work incredibly strongly to create stability. I also like to incorporate this version of the pose when I'm focused on a core strengthening sequence, because like in longer plank, when we reach that one arm forward, which we're gonna do in a moment, that works the anterior abdominals even more. The third condition, honestly, is when I just wanna change up my flow a little bit. If I feel like I'm getting a little stale or a little rote in my sequence, and I wanna incorporate something a little different for my students. To initiate the pose, we want to transition from down dog to plank. In plank, we want to do good basic plank stuff. We press the floor away, we broaden the shoulder blades, we draw the front ribs in, engage the thighs, and create a little hugging inward of the 2 thighs towards each other. Then maintaining that, we reach one arm forward till the fingertips come to the floor. Now this seems like it's going to be much easier than one arm, one leg plank, but unlike one arm, one leg plank, we're gonna hold this pose a little bit longer. So we start by pressing the floor away, we establish that good plank, then we reach the right hand a little forward and we come up onto the fingertips. When we're on the fingertips of the one hand, so we'll start with our right hand reaching forward, right fingertips to the floor. When we're on those fingertips, the opposite shoulder has to work a lot because we're not getting that much base from the reaching forward arm. So that stabilizing arm has to work incredibly strong. So we just get good isometric strength of all that musculature in the ball and socket. Then we switch. We come back to a conventional plank, reestablish our basics, press the floor away, lift the front ribs, engage the glutes, work the thighs. And then we do the same pose on the second side. We hold this for 2, 3, 4, maybe 5 breaths, but it gets really difficult quick. Then from there, we come back to a conventional plank. From conventional plank, we have all of our options. We can go back into down dog, we can do chaturanga, up dog, down dog, or we could go to the floor for locust or cobra. Our fourth variation is our first variation of forearm plank. I'll tend to put it in a higher level, level 2, 3, level 3 flow, where I want my students to be able to be strong and get warm and feel like they've been able to work their body in a really dynamic and robust way. My favorite way to set this pose up is actually from Sphinx pose. Now, the secret to making this pose a little bit more successful is taking a wider position with your feet. It is extremely common when people do this version of the pose that they'll get a lot of tilt to their body. Whatever leg they lift, they're gonna tilt that direction. And so if we take the feet a little bit wider, there's just a little bit more lateral stability in the pose, and people can typically stay more level. So we come into forearm plank and we take the feet as wide as the mats. Then before we lift anything, we root down the opposite diagonal. So if I know I'm gonna lift the right arm and the left foot, then I'm gonna tell my students, root down strongly through the left forearm, root down through the left hand, grip down through the right foot, lift the front ribs. Good, maintain that engagement now. Raise and reach the right arm forward, lift and reach the left leg backwards. 1 or 2 breaths, everybody. Of all of the versions that we're doing today, this is the most overtly demanding and therefore the most brief. So after that moment, we're gonna come down, we're gonna reestablish forearm plank, then we're gonna integrate the opposite diagonal. Depending on the intensity of class, we could do a couple repetitions. We can do 1 round, we can do 2 rounds, we can do 3 rounds. We can press back into dolphin pose, or we can just come all the way down to the floor for locust or cobra, and then transition back into our down dog. Our final variation of plank is our only variation of side plank. And everybody, this is kind of a novice version of side plank, but it's my favorite version of side plank because what it's going to allow for is a really complete whole body sustained strengthener, especially of the side body. We're gonna get good strength, not just in the shoulder, not just in the anterior core, but in the side of the core. So we're gonna get good strength in our lats. We're gonna get good strength in our obliques. We're gonna get good strength in our quadratus lumborum. And something that's really overlooked, especially in yoga, we're gonna get really good strength in our outer hip muscles, our abductors. I like to have my students hold this pose for anywhere from 3 to 6 breaths. I like to practice and teach this pose from longer plank. Once we transition into that long plank, we're just gonna roll to the outside of our right foot and we're gonna step our left foot mid-mat so the bottom of that left foot's on the floor. Now this is really unique, okay? So this makes the pose easier because we have more base, it makes it more stable, but also with good skill, it gives us more purchase to work our muscles. So what we're gonna do with that left foot, which we've stepped forward, is we're gonna press the bottom of the foot really strongly into the floor. And you're gonna feel this, everybody. When you press that left foot strongly down into the floor, you're gonna feel it in that same side hip. You're gonna feel those outer hip muscles working at a really good angle. In addition to that, by pressing that left foot down, you now have given the underside of the hip, the outside of the right hip, something to lift up into. So as that left foot presses down, we lift the right hip up, and those 2 legs, those 2 outer hips are now squeezing towards each other. So we're not just gonna get good strength in the right shoulder, we're gonna tell our students to press the floor away, to broaden that right shoulder, to lift the bottom ribs, to engage the bottom waist, to lift the hips. But we're gonna also tell our students to squeeze the outer hips towards each other. As we do that, we can reach the top arm up towards the ceiling, and students are gonna feel this as a complete whole body strengthener with an emphasis in outer hip strength. Once we've taken 3 to 6 breaths in the pose, like I said, this is something that we wanna linger over. You might even take more. Once we've done that, then we can step back into down dog, we can do the other side. And this is a really good pose to incorporate in any of your flows. But the 2 situations I tend to use it most in is when I'm doing a flow where I know that I'm going to be doing some arm balances, especially side planks. This just sets us up for other versions of side plank really well. The other scenario where I find myself as a teacher incorporating it is when I know I'm gonna do a lot of outer hip opening. Because usually when I do a lot of outer hip opening, unless it's a really soft, quiet, gentle class, I like to do some good strength work first. And this is a good whole body way to dial in to the outer hips and get them working, get them a little bit more toned before we transition into release work. If you're interested in more support, more depth, more guidance, be sure to check out my online trainings. They're listed in the caption below. And of course, everybody, it's really helpful for me if you like, subscribe, share with your students. Thanks a ton, take care, and keep enjoying your practice in your classes.